I've been attempting to brainstorm some business names. I came up with Pure Mountain Wellness and wrote down, as you build your mountain of wellness, may you be able to move away from the memes of mental health. I'm not sure about that one. And then my brain started going on to a different theme, a theme of creativity and how that is one of the qualities we get in touch with in so-called bipolar. And so I wrote down humanic creativity and wellness, because I like the word humanic because it's a combination of human and manic. And I probably won't use the word manic in the name, even though I'm tempted to. I don't think manic is a bad word or a bad thing, though it does get us in trouble for sure. I don't know where to start. I haven't really felt very insightful lately, but the last 2 days I have written down some insights related to creativity and a few things that I've read. And I wrote down again that it's important for me to shower in the morning, and I have been every day actually, so that's not something I'm writing down to remind myself, but just reminding myself that getting ready for the day right away is important. Getting up, I do some stretches in bed, and then lately I've been jumping on my trampoline for 10 minutes or so. This morning I did probably half an hour because I was actually listening to one of the audios I created in November of last year, because when I picked up my phone in the morning, that was on the screen, because I did make a playlist of some of them using iTunes Match. So the audios aren't on my phone, but I can access them through iTunes Match. And so that was there, so I just sort of decided to listen to it. And I was talking about when I went to the Hearing Voices group, and they had those people there who went to the Hearing Voices conference and talked about that. So interesting enough, I guess. But point being, I get up, do my stretches, jump on the trampoline, have a shower, and then eat some really healthy food. At least I have been since I've been back home. I make a smoothie with a bunch of good stuff in it, have a spoon of coconut oil, and so I've at least gotten some health in my body, and I've gotten my lymphatic system moving and done a bunch of healthy stuff. So the rest of the day, not that it doesn't matter, but at least I'm off to a good start, because I feel like there can be a tendency to move towards not taking care of the body as well. So taking care of the body is really important. And my days, I haven't been able to really spend time with myself, talking to myself very much. I have a few minutes here, so I'm going to talk to myself right now, because there's usually people around and stuff going on. So I'm going to try to figure out a way to talk to myself more, because I'm feeling impelled to do so again, because I've had some insights lately. And I was writing stuff around how the creativity that we come upon in so-called mania is one of the largest untapped resources in the world. And it would be interesting to create some kind of structure around that, because we do tap into creativity for sure. Even science is studying what's up with this whole bipolar creativity thing, and why not do something with it ourselves instead of just waiting for clinicians to tell us they're going to help us in a person-centered way with our creativity. We don't necessarily need help with our creativity. I came across a course by Stephen Kotler in my email, and it's a course through creativelive.com with Stephen Kotler, and I was tempted to buy it. It's $129 US and just see what it's all about. But it's really about how to get into creative states and creative flow. And I don't necessarily have a problem with that. It's more what to do with all of it, or how to channel it, or what to put it into, because there's so much of it, not trying to get into it. So I'm not sure if I'll buy that course or not, but it was interesting because I feel like people like me need to figure out ways to channel the overflow of creativity, not just get into flow. Because we get into these overflow states that eventually sort of blow out our entire nervous system, and then the ego recalcifies and contains us, and then it seems like we have this strange disorder of ups and downs, when really, to me, it's more of an expansion of creativity and an expansion of perception, which increases our possibilities and our potential in our epigenetic matrix. So then we're acting differently, in quotes, but really we're acting creatively. We're not acting according to our calcified ego structure. So that expansion comes in and suspends the ego and puts cracks in it so we can access other ways of being. And then eventually, like the tide, the ego sort of comes back in and puts a cage on us again. And I'm not saying that in terms of good and bad, but it's more how to move with that. Instead of, we don't necessarily have the brain that we can consciously sit down and try and do these things to get into flow states. We just go into this massive overflow. So how do we utilize that, or what do we do with that? And that's why I created Harvest Practice Embody for myself. And so when I flow, I overflow. And then after the overflow, I might look back and try and find out what I could harvest from that, and what I might practice in daily life, and what I might move to embody. And one of the things that I embody is just talking to myself about all of this, because that's sort of part of the Harvest Practice Embody. And I'm finding that it's difficult to do much else. And maybe that's all I'm supposed to do. I don't really know, because there's so much that I want to talk about with myself that I end up just talking about stuff with myself, editing it, and then, of course I do other stuff in my day, but it doesn't leave as much time and room for, I don't know what. I'm not really sure what. Maybe that's part of what I need to realize, is that there's not supposed to be something else per se. Because even this Muse headband thing, I was all excited about it, and now I'm just kind of like, so what, I earned some birds. I kind of understand how to meditate to some extent. And I'll still use it, and it could be helpful to see if I can get into even more calm spaces, for sure. But using with other people and stuff, that's where I get a little bit like, I don't know what to do. I really don't know what to do, so I just talk to myself. So I was thinking of doing a collective harvest, having people get together to harvest their insights together, and then maybe the collective practice being, what ideas do we want to put into play together? Instead of being, well, I'm going to do this little thing in my life. A lot of the ideas and visions are too big to carry out by oneself. And I have a lot of ideas and visions, but there's no way I can carry them all out by myself. So I find all I can really do is talk about my ideas and visions. And I think that's part of what happens in this map consciousness, is we go into this place of big ideas and visions, and then we come back to some semblance of ego functioning, yet we don't know how to carry these things out. And it's not just that we don't know how, it's we don't have the manpower. We can't do it by ourselves. So I think having a collective harvest where we share insights and ideas together might pave the way for something. I really don't know what. So it'd be cool to make up some languaging around this that is fun, around harvesting mania collectively together. And I feel like we would find that there is some kind of commonality, there's some kind of resonance of a world that is arising from within us, and we're talking about it as if it's real or possible, but it seems like hallucination or delusion to others because it's not really yet made manifest. But if we were to get together, then the possibility of some of that being made manifest is more possible, more probable. But if we don't, it'll just be us talking to ourselves like I am right now about possibilities. And I've been all over the map with what I've been writing about, and I haven't been writing about much, but it's all over the place, and there's no way I can organize it, even though I've tried once. I just will keep talking as it's sort of written in my book and keep going all over the map, because that's what I do. So I don't want to keep saying I wrote and I blah blah blah. Maybe I'll just say it and skip that part. I've been saying that for over a year, so maybe it's time to just say stuff, even though it might sound like I'm giving directions of some kind. I'm not. I'm just talking to myself. Don't make the mistake of the ego recoalescing as the body needing to end. So I realized that the ego recoalescing or descrambling is actually the death of creativity. So in so-called mania, it is a very creative state. And then when that creative state is ending, it feels like death. And what that is the ego recoalescing. So the ego dying is actually the creative state of that energy of creativity coming in. And it feels like death when actually the creativity is dying. I don't know if that makes sense. And the ego is retaking command. It's taking the driver's seat again. And it feels awful. And I was thinking of some new words for harvest, practice, and body. So harvest, I also thought of extract or extrapolate, or you could expand that to extract and extrapolate. And then practice as exercise. So these are all E words. And embody, that's just embody. So exercise is what can be practiced in daily life. So we might have a lot of different visions and ideas, but what can be practiced in daily life? And that's why I like this self-dialogue, is because it's sort of a combination of all the three in a way. It's really embodying this map consciousness or trans consciousness or omnipolar consciousness that just wants to talk about ideas and visions and insights. And what can I do in daily life from the harvest that the universe is asking of me? And I feel for me that is talk to myself about insights that I do harvest. And hopefully one day that will be talking to other people and actually doing some kind of action, whatever that may be, I'm not sure. And that leads me to the next principle. I can't do all this alone.
Ooh, a big yellow helicopter.
Goals are anti-expansion. So goals are something that the ego creates to go along a little path towards the goal. But expansion is in all directions. Creativity is in all directions. So creating goals is anti-expansion. And so I think just saying that now, I would add to my little harvest, practice, embody, which is exercise, extrapolate, extract, extrapolate, exercise, and then embody. It would be expand first. So first there's the expansion, which is the creativity, and then afterwards one can extract, extrapolate, exercise, and embody.
I need to add one more to the beginning of the equation. Energy is part of the expansion.
I did add expand on this next part here. Expand, but I wrote it up here just now. Not that all these little finicky things are important. They're not. Nothing really is. And then maybe I could add effortless, effort. So yeah, we don't need to be taught creativity, but we might need to understand how to channel it. And this is one way that I channel it, and it's been really helpful over the last year, I think. So it's important to know how to channel it, because right now, often it gets channeled into ego expansion. So when we expand, when we're in that creative energy, a lot of the energy gets diverted into expanding the ego self, and that can lead to things like I am God and things like that, because we feel that creative and powerful. But if that energy just stays in the creative space without adding to the ego structure, then what happens? It could be something different. Perhaps we can expand love and not the ego. Because often a lot of the creative energy is diverted into the structures that are already really conditioned in our brain, like the ego and like self protection, which is the ego.
And projection, too.
So, mania is the energy of creativity, which negates the self, because the self or ego is not creative. It's old, it's based on memory, it is conditioned, it's a pattern. So, mania equals no self equals creativity. And in its wake, that energy destroys the ego, because the ego is anti creativity, really. So it prevents our sense of who we are or what we are from expanding. It keeps it contracted, and then it keeps our behaviors and our patterns and our gestures in that limited framework. So the ego is a contraction. So this movement of this energy is really an expansion and a contraction of what we take to be self, or what we identify with. So we identify with a lot more when that energy of mania or creativity comes in. And the expansion process feels really, really good, and the contraction process feels really, really bad. It feels awful. And since our ego is conditioned with good and bad according to the self, when that expansion happens, we feel, oh, our self feels good. And then when the contraction, it's, oh, the self feels bad. So when the self feels bad, it starts projecting all these bad images and thoughts and memes. And when it feels good, it's projecting all these good ones. So really good is expansion and bad is contraction. But can we remove the good and bad from that and just feel it as expansion and contraction? Like breathing. We wouldn't say the in-breath is more important than the out-breath, or vice versa. It's just part of the process. So this energy is a different biorhythm. It's a different breath of life. But we're used to just having this consistent ego structure. We're not used to having this breath of self, or self-expansion and self-contraction. And even the expansion and contraction of the lungs don't expand just to expand. They actually expand to bring in nutrients and oxygen. So mania is like an in-breath where we're breathing in all this energy of creativity, and it's bringing in all this nutrition. And then that contraction where the ego recoalesces, maybe in something like a so-called psychosis or depression, is just the out-breath. It's like breathing out the carbon dioxide. But part of the trouble is that there's a hanging on. In that expansion, we feel so amazing that we try to hang on to it. And it's like holding our breath. If we hold our breath too long, then the carbon dioxide builds up in our body. And basically, that's what makes us breathe out eventually. We can't hold our breath indefinitely. And if something happens that happens, then we die. So really, the out-breath of psychosis is just a breath out, and perhaps because we're holding on to something, the self is trying to hold on to the good of mania and not realizing it's an expansion. And here comes the contraction. It has to contract. So seeing it in terms of expansion and contraction might be a little bit helpful, because good and bad is part of the ego structure. So anything that we can negate that is part of that self structure is going to help, because it's actually the self that gets in the way of this natural expansion and contraction. The self is that which prevents the expansion and contraction from happening naturally. And so when that prevention of the contraction and expansion breaks, when the ego breaks, there's a huge expansion and contraction at first, at least, until it starts to level out over time. So even though they say in mental health that each episode, as it's called, leads to further dysfunction and deficits, I don't actually feel that's true unless it's intervened with in the way that it is. If it's learned from, then that's not necessarily true. It can actually be learning, so then each time it's actually less. But when it's not taken as a learning, if there's no harvest practice embody, if there's just a medicate and medicate more and fear more and retract more in terms of the gestures of life, then it's going to cause the brain to shrivel up more. And then because we're not out in the field of life and moving in these ways, when the energy comes in to move us in other ways, it's going to feel a lot more disorienting than if we're already out there moving in a lot of those ways. So if I stay in my room all the time and then this energy comes in and I want to go out and frolic and do all these things, that's going to be a really big difference. And it's not something that I have all the brain cells from, because my brain has shrunk from just staying in a room. So then when the energy of expansion ends and I'm no longer able to frolic, it's going to feel even more scary to retract and retreat into the life of just staying in the room again. So it's sort of in a way like exposure therapy. One could think of harvest practice and body kind of like exposure therapy. So if I experience this extreme energy of so-called mania, and it was really amazing, and then that goes away, and then I just sit in my room, I'm not exposing myself. So one usually thinks of exposure therapy in terms of something scary or traumatic. So say I'm afraid of climbing a mountain, I'm afraid of heights, I'm afraid of that. So then I might climb the stairs and then climb up a building and then climb a mountain eventually. It's the same way. This harvest practice and body is a different type of exposure therapy. It's like, I expanded so high, so now I have to expose myself to those types of expansions in micro doses. So then when that expansion happens again, it doesn't actually feel so scary, or there's not such a big contraction. So that would be like if I climb a mountain, but then I never climb back down the mountain, coming back is going to be scary. But if I go up a small mountain, then I climb back down, then I go up a small mountain, then I climb back down, I'm going to be just as good at climbing the mountain as coming back down. But if I climb a mountain and then always take a gondola down, and then I decide to go to a mountain that doesn't have a gondola, I'm not going to be able to climb back down. So this is the expansion of that energy and then the contraction. We need to be able to practice all those behaviors that would lead us to climb a mountain and climb back down in that extreme energy without being afraid, and do it great on the first try. And then when the energy goes away, we can't do it and we don't understand how we even did that. But it gave us a blueprint that it's possible. So doing some of this positive type exposure therapy, and not therapy, I don't like that word, but just exposing oneself to the gestures and the ways of being that we experience when we had access to that expanded energy. And we are that expanded energy more than we are this limited self. But the limited self is generally going to recoalesce at some point. But if we practice being in those ways, maybe it will have less reasons to recoalesce. To go along with what I was just saying, me talking to myself in self-dialogue is a type of exposure therapy, because I usually only had access to these words like this when that energy of so-called mania would come in. But now I can do this pretty much any time. I don't have insights all the time, but more often I have access to them than not. Instead of them coming in a huge burst over a 1 month period and then burning out my nervous system, they'll come in burst throughout the day, and then maybe for a week I won't have access to them. And it's just a different pattern because I feel like I've created the neurophysiology and neurobiology and everything to be able to handle them. And I can see things in daily life instead of just when in those states. So I feel like that state of mania has become a trait. And so, just like if we take some kind of substance to get a state of awe and wonder, it's going to feel really good because, from what I said to myself in the last video that I just made up while I was saying it, this good is actually really expansion. So because if we take something like that, and I'm not advocating for that, I don't do that myself. My brain expands when it wants without any extra help. So, but if we do take something, then we feel great and one, and really that is the expansion, but it feels good. But now if one can expand in micro amounts every day, there's no real need for this big expansion that's felt as good. There's just this natural harmony, happiness in a way of these micro expansions instead of trying to do something in particular to get this big expansion. And that's what the first experience of map consciousness usually is. It's a huge expansion. And we can go our whole life trying to chase these huge expansions, or we can embody them in daily life so we don't actually need huge expansions to feel good. Instead of like a big expansion to feel good, there's just always a little expansion. So there's just this nice little burst of happy energy in a way, or joyful energy. And we could actually, it could be related to something like diabetes in a way, and not in the classic way that we're told in terms of mental illness, like take your medications like they do in diabetes, but in diabetes, by eating too much sugar, this is an oversimplification, eventually the body becomes insulin resistant, and then someone might eventually have to take exogenous insulin from the outside in order to allow the body to utilize insulin. So what I'm saying is, in the brain, we are bombarded all the time with the molecules of pleasure, like good, all the time, good, 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 that we become so resistant to it. We're so focused on good, getting something from the outside to feel good, that we're not actually expanding. We're just taking something to feel good, which is a fake expansion. It's not really expanding. So our body has become resistant to this good.